How does this lens, designed in the 80s, capture the heart of you and I, the modern-day portrait photographer? It's clear as a bell, right? You'd snag this lens because of its top-notch image quality, but that doesn't simply mean how sharp it is. So what is image quality? Let's take a look at bokeh first. Although you can take landscape photos with the Leica 75mm 1.4, and I'll show you a few of those, in most cases, that's not the primary subject matter for this lens. People are. Some photographers look at a lens's ability to melt away the background as a sign of amazing bokeh. But like practically everything in photography, even that is subjective. To me, this lens has amazing bokeh, but what I love about it is not the way it melts the background away, but how it paints what's left. Now don't get me wrong, you can melt if that's what you're into, but I find it far more interesting when it draws shapes in a manner that they are still recognizable, but don't distract from the subject matter. This will lead to a busier bokeh on occasion, but when it hits the mark, it's not just beautiful, but different. Sometimes, depending on choices made by you, the photographer, it's almost like you've taken a photo but disguised it as a painting. Look at this photo, for example, shot at f1.7. Take a look at the focus roll-off. Even though the mountain and the landscape it's attached to is bloody far away, the lens still renders structure in the out-of-focus areas. Whether it's the wire, the blotches of rock between the forest, it's not just butter. The bokeh is not just a molten blotch, but a part of the photo, painting a picture as much as the subject does. Because your sensor influences color, your mileage is going to vary, but the way the 75mm 1.4 paints color is especially suited for portraiture. It's refined. This is why. It's not overly saturated, but not muted either. The right words are vibrant and rich, but what's most important is it renders skin beautifully no matter what the complexion of the model is. The transition between the tones and skin is smooth and subtle. This is what you as a portrait photographer can love about this lens. If you've shot film before, the colors are almost the love child of Kodak Portra 160 and Fuji Pro 400H, two color film stocks with arguably the strongest reputation for skin tones. And this is not going to be your last tango with skin. Black and white is where the character of this lens is transformed into a totally different aesthetic. The smooth tones I just mentioned translate beautifully into black and white photos without color distracting from the subject. Combined with the bokeh, you really begin to hone in on that vintage classic quality of the lens design. Now speaking of tones, as most Leica lenses, even wide open, it has a decent amount of contrast. One of the reasons, however, that the tones are so smooth is because of the amount of micro contrast that the lens has, and Leica lenses are generally known for. This micro contrast combined with the way the lens responds to highlights on skin gives it a sort of glowy but textured feel at times, like you can see here. I never use lens hoods, but if you want to maximize the micro contrast of the lens with the way it handles highlights, then shoot it with a lens hood to minimize flare. Flare across your image can look just beautiful at times, but it's going to reduce the amount of micro contrast, which is a shame, especially if you like rich tones, which this lens is capable of. You see, it's exactly the play between the highlights of your image and micro contrast which brings about this slight glowy look at times. Now this 75mm lens, my 35mm, and my Noc Deluxe 50 are the only lenses I shoot with a lens hood in most cases, although with the 50 and the 75, this is more of a recent development. More about the lens hood in the section about my final recommendation. Sharpness. Now for portrait photographers like you and I, generally the higher the sharpness, the less ideal a lens becomes. When talking about lenses, to be honest, it's the metric I just care the least for. Nevertheless, wide open, some say it's soft and some are going to disagree. I would say if you nail the focus wide open, it's sharpest tack at the center, but it's not going to throw razors at your eyes. Stop it down, and to be honest, quite frankly, even a potato is going to produce sharp images at f8. What I appreciate about the sharpness of this lens in particular is the way it handles skin. You see, it's sharp enough to see detail. It doesn't turn it into some big mush of color, losing details, but it's not so sharp that your model is going to give you nasty looks because you've exposed her miserable skincare routine and everything that's in his or her pores. There's something gentle the way it handles the detail of skin. For portraiture, in 9 out of 10 cases, this is the holy grail. Wide open, there are some slight chromatic aberrations. It's got to be relatively extreme contrasty lighting for it to have the kinds of chromatic aberrations which I would bother correcting. Even vignetting wide open in most cases is slight. Often I think it works, so I don't correct the vignetting on my portraits. If you shoot into light, it's gonna flare, but much less than I would expect for a lens of this age. Okay, so let's talk about the focal length. 75mm is slightly wider than the traditional 85mm sweet spot for head and shoulder 3/4 portraits. I didn't feel like I was getting any extra space in my compositions when I first got this lens, but it's only when I shot the Zeiss 85mm indoors that I noticed that little bit of extra real estate that I got kind of used to when I was shooting the 75mm. Now, of course, you can make portraits with either. There's no difference. But when shooting a subject that is anywhere between 70 centimeters to 2.5 meters away, I prefer the little bit of extra real estate that the 75mm focal length affords me. Also, it partners way better with the 35mm focal length lens than an 85 does. But that's personal opinion, like everything else in this video. So, when you combine all of this, the character of the bokeh, the range of tones it captures, the micro contrast in combination with what I consider the right amount of sharpness, the little bit of extra focal length, irrespective if you're shooting color or black and white, you have an amazing lens to make beautiful portraits. It's one of the two lenses I will never sell. User experience is more about how you interact with something rather than the result it produces. UX design was a big part of my career once. If it wasn't obvious, this is a manual focus lens. The focus throw of the lens is 180 degrees, which depending on the size of your hand and the length of your fingers, it'll take anywhere between 4 to 5 twists of the lens to go from minimum focusing distance to infinity. Now the focus ring on my lens is smoothish, but demands a little bit more effort than I'd fancy. All right, the aperture ring, it clicks nicely, but sometimes I find myself at 1.7 when I didn't want to be. It has a little bit of give at 1.4, which is great, because I equate this to a teensy bit more speed, making the lens a f1.395. Oh, my lens is from the very first production batch of version 2 of this lens, so I'm not sure if this is simply wear and tear over the years, but there's more about versions in the section about my final recommendation. So, how does it handle on different camera systems? On Leica M cameras, there are a few points to be aware of. It can be tricky if you're using the rangefinder patch. My very first roll, I confused the 50mm and 75mm frame lines, just out of sheer habit of shooting 50, and my compositions weren't as I intended. User mistake though. And there's the fact that the 75mm frame lines are about just 1/3 of the whole viewfinder, so you're dealing with quite a bit less viewfinder real estate, but you can get used to it. Apparently the lens has a reputation for front or back focusing. Now some users say that their lens works well wide open for close to mid distances, but not for long to infinity. Others say that their lens had issues throughout the range. One way or another, if your lens has issues, it seems that in all cases, calibration at Leica or a very knowledgeable camera repair fellow has solved the issues. If you use Live View or the VisiFlex viewfinders for the digital M's, all of the above is not relevant. With my Leica M10P, that is the way I shot it the most. Now, a quick note on analog M's. The 75mm frame lines were introduced with the M4P, so M4s and before won't have them. And when you combine film with this lens, you get a very special look. The colors just pop right off and just really display that beautiful vibrance I mentioned earlier. I especially enjoy combining this lens with low-speed black and white film. The combination of micro contrast and the way film handles highlights makes the most beautiful tones and contrasts. Now on Leica SL cameras, it's a dream lens. It's like it experiences a rebirth. You can see how it responds to highlights and light right there in real time. You have the benefit of the full viewfinder real estate, and more on that in my one last bit of honesty section in this video as well. You can nail critical focus every single time, irrespective of whether you use magnification or focus peaking. I use magnification. It balances a little bit more favorably than the Noctilux, sitting right in the cusp of what I'd say is like the bee's knees in terms of size and heft for the camera. Of course, this is comparing to the other lenses designed for the M mount. Compared to SL lenses, it's quite the smaller chap, naturally. One more thing, on most of the modern digital M and SL cameras, you will be able to set the lens profile for this lens. Now, I assume that Leica has made some calibrations in the image beyond the EXIF information, but I can't say for certain. If anyone does know, please let me know. Alright, now what if you don't own a Leica camera, but you own a Sony or a Canon or whatever else mirrorless type camera? Is this a lens for you? Let me put it to you this way. If you have no Leica gear whatsoever, but you're interested, and you've got the choice of buying either a Leica lens or a Leica camera, if it's me, I will pick the lens first every single time. If you can get past the fact that this is a manual focus lens, you'll have a look in your photos which none of the current lens lineups from any of the manufacturers except Leica and Zeiss and possibly Voigtlander are going to be able to give you. But take that with a grain of salt. You know, there's people who completely disagree with me and like-minded persons who say that there is no such thing as a Leica look or a Zeiss pop, and quite frankly, fair play to them. So, what about if you want to shoot this on a digital medium format camera like, say, the Fuji GFX or the Hasselblad X system? Well, then you still have all the character of this lens and a little bit extra real estate, but what about the vignetting? Here's the deal. Wide open, in the closest focusing distance it does the best. You'll need to crop and do some fixing in post, but here, because of the low light image, I didn't have to fix anything in post. Wide open at infinity, it worsens a little bit. At f16, you basically have unfixable hard vignetting from minimum to infinity. Cost-wise, as most Leica M lenses, it's not cheap. Generally, with Leica lenses which aren't produced anymore, the price is relatively steady until it gets hyped up. For reference though, in 2016, I paid $3,000 for it on eBay. Is the bokeh and the effect it has on skin worth it? Well, let's look at that. Who isn't this lens for? Now, this is important, but I mean it sincerely. If you think that by slapping on this lens, your photos are going to improve, you will be disappointed. No matter the lens, it's always going to be your photography skills which will make a beautiful photo. A good photographer will make a beautiful photo with a frying pan, quite frankly. If you care about end-to-end sharpness, if you care about autofocus, or you prefer the look of modern lens design, this lens is not for you. If you don't care about micro contrast and tones and ever so slightly obsess about these qualities in your photos, this lens is not for you either. If all this talk makes you think more of the Emperor's New Clothes, you already know you ain't buying this lens. If you think Leica is more branding, especially the overpriced type, than it is quality and over 150 years of optical engineering and information and know-how, this lens might not be for you. I say might because you can still think all that, but appreciate the kind of image Leica 75mm Sumilux gives you. So, who could this lens be for? Well, the photographer who buys this lens doesn't have to articulate technically what makes this lens so special, but he or she sees that the photos you take with it look different than, say, the Nikon 85mm 1.8 from the same time period. Or you see that although the Sigma 85mm 1.4 is an absolute beast of a portrait lens, it's the nuanced tonal qualities of the Leica 75mm Sumilux that you want to see in your portraits. If you're the kind of photographer who is willing to figure out the lighting conditions and the photography style which will get this lens to shine, or you simply obsess a little about how skin looks like in your photo, well, then this 75mm is a lens you should check out. Now, it's a lot of money, and I don't like recommending anyone to spend such large amounts, so, ideally rent before you buy if you can. But if you're the patient type, you should be able to get what you paid for if you decided to sell it again. Alright, let's assume you want to buy it. Here's some background information to help you understand why I think version 2 is the lens to buy. But first, I'd never ask you to subscribe or like the video, but if you did, fist bumped my heart like 4 times or so. Alright, Dr. Walter Mandler designed the 75mm Sumilux. He's kind of a big deal in Leica and lens history overall. He based the 75mm on the same design he used for the original 50mm Noctilux f1. Now, to call that lens cult or legendary or, depending on the hat you're wearing, overhyped, is totally fair. Mandler at one point said that the 75mm was his favorite, which doesn't mean much at all, actually, because after all, we're dealing primarily in subjectivity. But it does add a lot of weight to the heritage of this lens. So 3 versions of this lens were made. Version 1 and 2 were made in Canada under Mandler's watchful eye. Version 3 in Germany. Now version 1 does not have a built-in hood, but more annoying is the minimum focusing distance of just 1 meter. Version 2 and version 3 both do have built-in hoods. Remember, I like the hood to minimize flare and maximize micro contrast. Built-in is less cumbersome than carrying one with you, but more excitingly, they have a minimum focusing distance of officially 80 centimeters, but it goes past to somewhere between 70 to 75. So it's between versions 2 and 3. The difference between these two is that when Leica moved the lens production from Canada to Germany in 1986, I think, they changed the mount on the lens, shaving off 40 grams. Now, if that 40 grams is important to you, version 3 is the one to buy. Most likely, the coatings on newer lenses made after the 2000s are less impacted by age, but then again, the newest version 3 you'll get is 17 years old as of 2024. The oldest is 37 years, and there's no guarantee for how its owner treated it. Here's another deciding factor. The lesser informed buyer may pay a slightly higher price for a version 3 made in Germany inscription on the barrel. I get it, because it's Leica, it's made in Germany. You might think it's better quality even. You'd be mistaken. The optical design is exactly the same, but version 2 was the last version to be made under Mandler's direct supervision in Canada. According to the best timeline I could piece together, the production of the lens was moved to Germany 1 year before Mandler's retirement. But correct me if I'm wrong on that. Regardless, just as made in Germany doesn't increase the quality of the lens, nor would the fact that Mandler was still running the production, checking out each single lens. He wasn't checking each single lens at all. But for me, I'd rather pay a little less money for a made in Canada Mandler batch version 2 with the built-in hood and the 70 centimeters plus minus minimum focusing distance than pay more for a 40 grams lighter lens with the made in Germany inscription and only a slightly lower chance of, less affected coatings. Alright, one last bit of honesty before you buy this lens if you do. I bought it in 2016 because I wanted the portrait focal length for my analog Leica M7 to help me get closer to the subject. My longest focal length at the time was 50 millimeters. But the nuances of this lens only really became apparent to me 4 years later on my Leica M10P and especially on my Leica SL2S. Now you see, I want you to have this context so you understand that the level of nuances I've been speaking about in this video is one that I really didn't even notice for 4 years. Now that's some subtlety to this nuance. But even though nuanced, at least to this photographer, the Leica 75mm Zoom Lux offers a look I don't want to part with. Pair this lens with a high-resolution electronic viewfinder, a sensor with gorgeous color signs like the Leica SL2S, some great light, a human being you want to make a photo of, and this lens will be your friend to you, the modern-day portrait photographer. Like I said, it's one of only 2 lenses I will never sell. If you decide to buy this lens, let me know. Tag me in your favorite photos on Instagram or send me a link. I'd love to see what you make. Double fist bump.